Nobody taught you how to be alone. It just happened. And somewhere between then and now, you stopped noticing that it still is. There's something quietly strange about a person who can sit in a room full of people, laugh at the right moments, respond when spoken to, and still feel like they're watching everything from behind glass. Not dramatically, not in a way anyone would notice. Just slightly removed, like you showed up, but a part of you didn't quite make it through the door. Most people would call that shyness, or introversion, or just being tired. And maybe those things are also true, but there's a specific kind of distance that isn't really about personality, and it isn't really about exhaustion. It's more like a habit of separation, so old you can't remember a time before it. You've probably gotten very good at functioning inside it. You know how to seem present. You know how to hold a conversation, ask the follow-up question, make someone feel heard. You might even be the person others come to when they're struggling, because there's something about the way you listen, some patient, careful quality that makes people feel safe. And you give that freely, genuinely. It's not performance. But afterward, when the conversation ends and the room empties or the call drops, there's this particular stillness. And in that stillness, without quite meaning to, you start to wonder why the same thing you just gave to someone else feels so difficult to find for yourself. That's not a paradox. That's a pattern. And it started a long time before you had words for it. There's a version of loneliness that's loud and obvious. The kind that comes from being excluded, ignored, visibly left out. That kind leaves marks people can point to. It has a story, a beginning, sometimes even a name attached. But there's another kind that's harder to locate. It doesn't come from being left out. It comes from being present and still feeling absent. From growing up in rooms where you were physically there, maybe even loved, but something essential about you just didn't have anywhere to land. Not because people were cruel, sometimes because they were simply too busy or too distracted or too caught up in their own quiet survival to notice what you were quietly carrying in yours. Children are remarkably good at adapting to emotional environments. They'll become whoever the room needs them to be. Smaller, easier, less inconvenient. Not out of weakness, out of intelligence, out of a very accurate reading of what's available and what isn't. And the strange thing about that kind of adaptation is that it doesn't feel like loss at the time. It feels like coping. It feels, in some moments, almost like strength. You learned not to need too much. You learned to manage your own inner weather without asking anyone to hold an umbrella with you. That felt like self-sufficiency. It looked like maturity. What it actually was is a question worth sitting with. Because here's what tends to happen, and this is where it gets uncomfortable in a way that's hard to dismiss. The self that learned to need less didn't stay in childhood. It came with you. It got dressed in adult clothes and walked into adult relationships and adult friendships and adult versions of the same rooms, and it kept doing the same thing it always did. It kept making itself smaller in ways too subtle to explain. It kept giving more than it said out loud that it needed back. It kept mistaking someone's distraction for evidence that it had once again asked for too much, even when it hadn't asked at all. Overthinking at 2 in the morning is rarely about the specific thing you're thinking about. The replayed conversation, the unanswered message, the moment where you said something and watched someone's expression shift and spent the next 3 hours trying to decode what that shift meant. Those aren't the actual problem. They're the surface. Underneath them is something much older, a mind that learned early that connection was conditional and uncertain, and never fully stopped scanning for the moment it disappears. That's exhausting in a way that's hard to explain to someone who hasn't felt it, because from the outside, nothing is wrong. You're fine. You said you're fine. You probably even believed it when you said it. There's a kind of grief that has no event attached to it, no loss you can point to, no specific moment where everything changed, just a low, persistent sense of something missing, something you can't name clearly because you're not sure you ever fully had it to begin with. Not love, necessarily. Not safety. Something more like being truly, unhurriedly known. Not just understood in the way people mean when they say, "I get you." Something quieter and more complete than that. You might have looked for it in friendships that slowly drifted without explanation, in connections that felt real and then, almost imperceptibly, became surface level, in relationships where you did everything right and still somehow ended up on the outside of something you couldn't identify. And instead of concluding that those things were simply impermanent or that the other person had their own inner life pulling them elsewhere, some part of you quietly concluded something about yourself. That conclusion is worth examining, not because it's dramatic, not because you're broken or damaged or carrying wounds that define you, but because a conclusion formed in childhood, without your full awareness, without your consent, without the context you now have as an adult, is still quietly running in the background, organizing your choices, shaping what you allow yourself to want, deciding on your behalf what's realistic to expect from closeness. And most people never look at it directly, not because they're avoidant, but because it doesn't announce itself. It just feels like personality, like this is simply who you are. But what if it isn't who you are? What if it's only who you became under specific conditions a long time ago? In the next part, we'll start to look at exactly how that happened, not in a general, theoretical way, but in the specific, quiet mechanics of how a child's emotional environment actually shapes the nervous system, the attachment patterns, and the parts of you that still, without realizing it, are waiting for something you learned not to ask for. If this content speaks the words you can't explain, click subscribe. Thank you for your support. At some point, you stopped expecting to feel fully seen and started expecting to feel mostly fine. That's a quiet shift, unremarkable from the outside. But something does change in a person when they relocate their emotional baseline from connection to adequacy. When the internal question stops being, "Do I feel close to this person?" and becomes, "Is this okay enough to live with?" You don't decide to make that trade. It just settles in. Slowly, the way furniture you've had for years stops being something you chose and becomes simply part of the room. The strange part isn't that it happened. The strange part is how long it's possible to not notice. There's a specific kind of tiredness that doesn't come from doing too much. It comes from managing, constantly, the distance between what you actually feel and what feels safe to show. Not in a dramatic sense, not suppressing rage or swallowing grief, but in the small, persistent way of someone who has learned to always translate their inner experience before sharing it, to edit, to soften, to make it easier to receive. You don't do this to deceive anyone. You do it because somewhere along the way, you picked up the quiet belief that your inner experience in its raw form is slightly too much, not wrong, just too much. And that belief operates mostly below awareness. You're not consciously thinking, "I need to make myself more palatable." It just comes out in how you answer when someone asks how you're doing. In the half-truth you offer that's technically accurate, but leaves the most important part out. In the way you'll describe something painful with enough humor around it that the person you're telling ends up laughing instead of understanding what it actually cost you. There's a particular loneliness in making someone laugh about the thing that hurt you the most. Identity is a word people throw around casually, but the experience of not quite knowing who you are underneath your habits, your roles, your way of moving through social situations, that's not casual at all. It has a texture. It shows up in moments that shouldn't be disorienting, but somehow are like someone asks what you want for dinner, and you realize you genuinely don't know. Not because the question is difficult, but because the habit of deferring to what works for everyone else has quietly eroded the signal that tells you what you actually want. Small things. People dismiss them as small things, but that erosion doesn't stay contained to dinner preferences. It seeps. Over time, it starts to affect bigger, quieter questions about what kind of life feels like yours, about which relationships you actually want versus which ones you've simply maintained because the exit felt unkind, about what you'd say or do or allow if your first instinct wasn't immediately followed by a calculation of how it would land. The self that calculates all the time gets very good at its job. It also gets very quiet about its own needs. There are people who can walk into a room and be entirely present in it. You can feel that about them, the way they occupy space without seeming to negotiate it. And then there are people who arrive somewhere and almost immediately begin the background process of assessing the room, reading dynamics, sensing who needs what, adjusting accordingly, not performing exactly, more like preemptively adapting, making themselves compatible before compatibility is even required. If you recognize that, it probably doesn't feel like a problem from the inside. It feels like attentiveness, like emotional intelligence even. And it might be both of those things, but it's also worth asking what it costs, and more specifically, what you're doing when you're doing all of that. Because the attention you're spending on the room, on other people's moods, on the social temperature, is attention not being spent on your own interior. And over years, that habit creates a strange kind of vacancy, a person who is perceptive about everyone around them and genuinely uncertain about themselves. It's a disorienting place to live, and it tends to be invisible to the people around you because from the outside, you seem so together. Sometimes the disconnection isn't from other people, it's from your own memories. There are moments that should have mattered more than they did. Experiences that happened to your body but felt strangely distant, like you were noting them rather than having them. A celebration that didn't quite feel celebratory. A moment of warmth that came and left without really landing. Something that should have moved you, and you waited for the feeling, and it arrived slightly late or slightly muted. Or maybe it arrived fully but was gone before you could hold on to it. That's not a mood disorder. It's not coldness. It's something more specific, a self that learned under the right conditions to stay slightly behind the glass even during the good things. Because presence, real presence, requires a kind of openness that once felt unsafe. And the nervous system, if it was trained early enough in the logic of keeping distance, will sometimes apply that logic indiscriminately. Not just to the difficult moments, to all of them, which means that some of the most important moments of your life may have passed through you rather than fully reaching you. And there's a specific grief in that realization, not dramatic, just quiet, and very, very particular. You might have felt it recently, not as a thought, but as a sensation. A moment where life was objectively good, where things were going well by any reasonable measure, and underneath it, almost completely detached from the circumstances, there was this low, ambient ache. Not depression, not exactly, more like homesickness, except you're not sure where for. Not a place, not even a time. Something more like a version of yourself that never quite got the conditions it needed to fully arrive. That feeling doesn't have a clean explanation, and most people who have felt it have also learned not to mention it, because it sounds ungrateful, or irrational, or like something that should already have been resolved by now. But it's not irrational, and it hasn't resolved because it was never just a feeling, it's a signal, pointing toward something structural, something that was shaped quietly and early and has been influencing the architecture of your emotional life in ways that are only now beginning to become visible. In the next part, we'll start to look directly at that architecture, at the specific psychological mechanism underneath all of this, the one that formed before you had any say in it, and the reason it doesn't simply disappear when your circumstances improve or when you know, intellectually, that you're safe, because knowing it isn't the same as the part of you that learned it, believing it. And understanding the difference between those two things, that's where something starts to shift. Here's something that's genuinely difficult to sit with. Most of what feels like your personality might be, at least in part, a solution. Not who you fundamentally are, but what you became in response to an environment that required a specific shape from you. And the disorienting thing about that isn't that it happened, it's that the solution worked. You made it through, you adapted, and now the adaptation is so familiar, so woven into how you move and speak and relate, that dismantling any part of it feels less like growth and more like loss. That's not a small thing to realize. Think about the version of you that's easy to be around, patient, undemanding, good at sensing what others need before they ask. There's genuine warmth in that. That's not fabricated. But underneath the warmth, if you stay with it long enough, there's also something else. A very old fear that your neediness, your real needs, the ones you don't soften before sharing, would make people leave, or withdraw, or look at you differently. Not because anyone explicitly told you that, but because something in your early emotional environment communicated it clearly enough that you learn the lesson without being taught it directly. Children don't need to be told something explicitly for it to become true inside them. Absence teaches, distraction teaches. The moment you reached for someone and they were physically present but emotionally somewhere else, that taught something, not a belief you chose. A conclusion the younger version of you drew from available evidence with the limited interpretive tools of a child, in a moment when it needed to make sense of something it couldn't yet fully understand. And the conclusion wasn't, they were distracted. The conclusion was something much closer to home. There's a particular way this shows up that most people never quite name. It's the gap between what you want from a relationship and what you allow yourself to ask for. Not dramatically, not in a way you'd identify as suppression, more like a quiet internal edit that happens so fast you barely catch it. You feel something, a need for reassurance, a desire for more closeness, a wish that someone would check in without you having to initiate. And before that feeling can fully form into a request, something preemptively deflates it. Reminds you not to need too much. Reminds you that asking is a risk. So you don't ask. And then the need doesn't disappear, it just goes underground. It starts showing up sideways as irritability you can't fully explain, or a sudden coldness after a moment of closeness that felt too exposed, or a restlessness inside relationships that are, by any fair measure, good. And then you feel guilty about the restlessness because nothing is wrong, and that makes it worse, because now you're managing both the unmet need and the feeling that wanting more is somehow unreasonable. That's an exhausting internal loop. And it runs quietly enough that most people living inside it have chalked it up to being difficult or emotionally complicated or just not built for the kind of closeness they actually want. There's a form of self-rejection that doesn't look like self-rejection at all. It looks like self-sufficiency. It looks like independence. It looks like the kind of low-maintenance emotional presence that people describe as easy to be around. And those descriptions probably feel good to receive because they confirm that the adaptation is working, that you have successfully made yourself someone who doesn't cause problems, doesn't burden anyone, doesn't take up too much space. But here's what's underneath that. The belief, operational and persistent, even if intellectually you dispute it, that the version of you which takes up more space, which asks more directly, which needs and shows the needing openly, is not someone people would stay for. That the full version of you, unedited, is a liability. And so you offer the curated version, the one that's easier to love, the one that has already done the work of making itself manageable. And then you wonder why. Even in close relationships, there's a faint but persistent sense of not being fully known. You can't be fully known by people who have only ever met the edited version of you. The part that makes this genuinely complicated is that the editing isn't dishonest. It doesn't feel like a lie. It feels like consideration, like empathy. You're not suppressing yourself because you're ashamed. You're doing it because you've absorbed the idea that managing your own emotional weight is a form of care for others, that not burdening people is a virtue, that wanting things quietly or not at all is a kind of emotional maturity. And in a different context, under different conditions, some of that would even be true. Restraint has its place. Not every feeling needs to be spoken, but there's a point where it stops being consideration and becomes erasure, where the habit of editing yourself protects not just others from discomfort, but protects you from the specific vulnerability of being seen and possibly still not chosen. That's the fear at the center of this, not abandonment in the dramatic sense, something quieter. The fear that if you stopped performing adequacy, if you let the full, unmuted version of yourself be present in a relationship, the relationship might quietly reveal itself to have been built for the edited version only. And that revelation would be, in some ways, harder to survive than never having tried. So you don't fully try. You stay at a careful, functional distance, even from the people you love. Especially from the people you love. What's slowly becoming visible here, and it's uncomfortable in a way that's hard to dismiss, is that what feels like a fear of others leaving might be, underneath it, something you're also doing to yourself. The same distance you maintain from other people, the same careful editing, the same preemptive management of how much you allow in, you apply it inward too. There are versions of yourself you haven't fully met. Needs you've never given room to exist without immediately qualifying them. Feelings that arrive and get assessed for reasonableness before they're allowed to be felt. That's not a character flaw. It's a very logical response to a very early experience of emotional reality. But logic and livability are different things. And what's beginning to surface, not as a solution, but as a question, is whether the same self that learned to need less might also be capable of slowly, imperfectly, learning something different. Not optimism, not healing as a destination. Something more modest and more real than that. Just the beginning of a different kind of attention, turned inward for once, without the edit. In the next part, we'll look at what that actually means in practice, not as self-improvement, but as something closer to a recognition. A shift in how you see what's been happening, and maybe, for the first time, why it might be allowed to happen a little differently. There's a specific moment that happens sometimes, not dramatically, not as a breakthrough, just quietly, when you're doing something ordinary, washing dishes, sitting in traffic, lying still before sleep, and something shifts, not a revelation, more like a small adjustment in angle, the same landscape, but seen from slightly left of where you've always stood. And in that shifted position, something you've carried for years looks, for the first time, a little different. Not resolved, just different. That's what this feels like. Not an answer, a different angle. Because here's what becomes possible when you stop trying to fix these patterns and start simply looking at them. you begin to notice that they were never random. Nothing about the way you've moved through your emotional life has been arbitrary. The distance you keep, the editing you do, the way you loop back at 2 in the morning over a conversation that most people would have forgotten by now, none of that is malfunction. It's a system, a very coherent, very internally logical system built by someone who needed it to work. That someone was younger than you are now, considerably younger, and they didn't have what you have now. The distance of time, the context of understanding, the capacity to look back and see the full picture rather than just the immediate emotional weather of a given moment. They worked with what they had, and what they built with those limited tools kept them functional, kept them connected enough, kept them safe enough. The question that starts to matter once you see it this way isn't why you're like this. It's something quieter, something closer to what would it mean to update the system, not overhaul it, not dismantle it in some act of self-improvement, but simply acknowledge that it was built for a world that is no longer entirely the world you're living in. One of the things that shifts when you look at it this way is the self-criticism. Not entirely, not all at once, but there's a particular harshness that tends to accompany the awareness of your own patterns. The frustration with yourself for still overthinking. The judgment about why you can't just be present in relationships the way other people seem to be. The quiet contempt for the part of you that still preemptively manages other people's comfort at the cost of your own. That harshness makes sense too, because the same intelligence that built the system is also capable of seeing its limitations. You can observe yourself people-pleasing and feel a kind of internal wince, knowing why you're doing it anyway, and criticizing yourself for both. That's not weakness. That's the dissonance of a person in the middle of changing, which is a deeply uncomfortable place to be because you're no longer fully the old version and not yet whatever comes next. But the self-criticism, as familiar as it is, might be worth examining. Because if the patterns were never personal failures, if they were always adaptations, responses, solutions built under specific conditions, then criticizing yourself for having them is a little like being frustrated at a past version of yourself for not knowing something you only learned later. The knowledge wasn't available yet. The conditions weren't there. You couldn't have done differently with what you had then, even if you can now. That's not an excuse. It's just accurate. Something that rarely gets acknowledged is how much energy emotional self-protection actually uses. Not the dramatic kind, not the energy of active distress or visible suffering, but the low-grade, continuous expenditure of maintaining the distance. Staying slightly behind the glass, pre-reading rooms, managing impressions in ways so automatic you don't register them as effort anymore. When that energy gets noticed, really noticed, not judged, just observed, it often comes with a kind of tiredness that's been there so long it felt like a permanent feature of existence. The kind of tired you wake up with, the kind that isn't fixed by sleep, and sitting with that tiredness, without immediately trying to solve it, without immediately converting it into a plan or a self-improvement project, sometimes does something unexpected. It starts to suggest, quietly, that maybe the exhaustion isn't evidence that something is wrong with you. Maybe it's just evidence that you've been working very hard for a very long time at something that was never supposed to be permanent. There are things you've mistaken for your personality that are actually just your history, the reluctance to ask directly for what you need. The way closeness, when it arrives fully, sometimes triggers a low-level alarm rather than comfort. The pull towards self-sufficiency so strong it occasionally tips into isolation without you intending it. The sense that your emotional inner world is somehow too dense, too specific, too difficult to translate into something another person could receive without it becoming a burden. None of those are who you are. They're where you've been. And the difference between those two things, once you feel it rather than just intellectually note it, is surprisingly significant. Not liberating, necessarily. Not immediately. But significant. Because if they're where you've been rather than who you are, then there's a version of yourself that exists outside of them. Not a better version. Not some ideal future self, just the actual self. Less managed, less pre-edited, less perpetually braced. That self isn't far away. It's not buried under years of work. It's just been waiting, quietly, behind the habit of not quite letting things land. What changes, when you see it this way, isn't your life, at least not right away. What changes is the quality of attention you're able to bring to it. Instead of moving through your emotional habits on autopilot, frustration cycling into self-judgment, cycling into the same patterns again, there's occasionally a small pause, a moment of noticing. Not fixing, just noticing. And in that noticing, something that was unconscious becomes very slightly conscious. Which is all that seeing differently really means. It doesn't fix the 2 a.m. overthinking. It doesn't immediately dissolve the careful distance in relationships. It doesn't make closeness feel suddenly safe or the need for approval suddenly irrelevant. But it does change what those things mean. They stop being evidence of how damaged you are and start being information about where you've been and what you've been carrying. And carrying something you understand, even if it's still heavy, is a different experience than carrying something you don't. That's not resolution. It's not a conclusion. It's just a quieter way of being with yourself than the one you've probably been practicing for most of your life. And maybe that's worth sitting with for a while, without deciding yet what to do about it. If any part of this resonated with you in a way you didn't expect, I'd genuinely like to know. Leave it in the comments, not the polished version of it, the actual version, the one you'd usually edit before sharing.